Hello. Today I want to talk about something quite interesting that I thought about in terms of Victorian architecture. And many people, especially modernists and many architects from the 20th century and 21st century, seem to criticize is that they were looking at previous examples of architecture to inspire their own works instead of making their own style for the time. However, architecture usually represents what the nature of the society is at the moment. And 19th century Europe was quite an interesting place to be in. After the events of the French Revolution, the American Revolution, and over a series of social events, including Romanticism, it moved people to appreciate and think about a series of number of different things. For instance, in Europe, it had been quite common since the Renaissance to look at the Greek and Roman examples to make their own styles of architecture. You can see this in Renaissance, Baroque, Rococo, Neoclassicism, Greek Revival, Roman Revival. You name it. There has been quite a lot of styles that were directly inspired by the classical architecture styles. However, when it comes to the 19th century, there's a lot of different opinions at the same time, which makes architects to look at a variety of points of view on what architecture should be, on what architecture is, and what the spirit of the people is at the moment, which is not one unified thing. Um, Many people are trying to look for some kind of patriotism for the country, some kind of nationalistic point of view. Some of the people were trying to dissuade people from leaving the classical ideals, which means some people still did the uh, classical inspired architecture. There were some people that were looking at religion as a way of orientating, giving a direction for their lives. There were many things going on at the same time. Arguably, there were many more things going on in the 19th century than in the 20th century, despite the 20th century having a lot of technological advancements in comparison to the 19th century. So, the Victorian styles of architecture, the revivals, the historicism, does reflect in some way or another people looking back at the past and inspiring their architecture on what the ideals of the people were at the time. We see this in the Gothic revival of Romanticist thinkers that were thinking about the medieval times, especially the late medieval. Um, we see this in people that were looking at the Renaissance ideals and they did the Neo-Renaissance or Renaissance revival. um, you know, it was not consistent. It was not entirely consistent. Everyone at the same time was looking at different points of view and of what they considered to be architecture to be, and this possibly was born due to the conflict between neoclassicism and romanticism. Romanticism evoked the idea that every region should aspire not only for creativity but also at their own style of architecture and well not only architecture at their own local traditions to keep them and not to settle for something that does not represent them to go for the individual experience rather than the overall experience rather than go for universal concepts or make some universal style of architecture like neoclassicism. Romanticism would prefer for Greek buildings to be Greek buildings, for English buildings to be English buildings, for Persian buildings to be Persian buildings, and so on and so forth. So in this regard, Victorian architecture probably does represents the society better than any other stage because it represents that there is more than one opinion going on at the same time. You can still argue though that of course there's transition eras, like there was still Gothic buildings being built during the Renaissance time. There were still Renaissance era buildings, well, Renaissance style buildings when the Baroque began. You can make that argument and it's completely valid, but at the same time there used to be one predominant style of architecture, whereas in the two no in the Victorian time there was not such a thing. I mean, I do know that the Gothic revival was especially famous throughout the UK and some other countries, and eventually you could say it probably was the leader of them, possibly due to people getting to this idea of nationalism and everybody making the different revolutions that led to different countries such as Belgium being born. Um, so yeah, you could say that Victorian architecture, despite not being one style of architecture, it has this common trend of showing what the people were thinking at the time, and also how different people, how there were contrasting ideas. You actually get this even within some really famous public buildings. The Palace of Parliament of Westminster, for instance, was done in the Gothic Revival style, but the proportions are not usual from a Gothic style building. They are more similar they are more akin to what a classical building would try to do. So sometimes and this even leads us to some of the movements that were probably the most interesting to examine. Like for instance, there was this Indo-Saracenic style, which basically combined the Indian styles of architecture, especially Mughal architecture, with Gothic, and it does represent different interactions between different countries. So again, it just the 19th century had so many things going on at the same time that there was just inevitably going to be such a wide variety of them. And actually, I consider that to be quite a positive plus because it led to the 20th century pretty much doing the same. There were a variety of different opinions, but in this case, they were not looking anymore at the past, but moving and trying to define what society should be, not based on what there was already before them, but because of their own ideals that they made on their own. And ultimately, this led to architecture being such a su- having such a big variation across the 20th century, and even in our day, there's a variety of different opinions. There is, though obviously the century, it's only been 16 years, so there's obviously not that much variety in comparison to the 20th century. But eventually, I do believe that there will be tons of architectural movements throughout the 21st century. So yeah, it's quite interesting. Victorian architecture, despite being stylistically opposed to what many of the styles of the 20th century were trying to do, with probably some extensions being Art Deco, which drew from some classical examples, or Art Nouveau, which did start in the late 19th century, but at the same time, and was quite creative, but at the same time did not refrain itself from making references to previous styles of architecture. I do believe that the Victorian era started something really interesting in architecture, and possibly critics might appreciate, people might appreciate Victorian architecture for this reason more in the future. So that's pretty much what I wanted to say about Victorian architecture. And actually, this inspires me to do quite a few more videos. And I do promise I will make an Art Nouveau one later on, possibly Art Deco as well. So I'll finish it there, but it's just that Victorian architecture is not inherently a bad thing. It just had a really different focus, and it was trying to get some kind of historical precedent towards what the society should be. And that is pretty much what architecture had been trying to do over the last, since the Renaissance, really, because Gothic was a natural evolution again. But Victorian architecture, yeah, it just shows the variety of opinions that there were at the time. So in that way, it is really effectively something from the 19th century. There may be not one style of the 19th century that represents everyone, but that's because there was not such a thing, because everyone was opposing different points of view. Some people were trying to stay with neoclassical ideas, some people were trying to move towards national liberal state, independence. It's just incredible. And in that regard, the 19th century is probably one of the most interesting times in architectural history, because you can talk about the 18th century, you can talk about the 17th century, and so on, and you can speak about a certain movement in style. Uh, but you are talking about one style. You're not talking about the whole society. Whereas with Victorian architecture, you have to know quite a lot of more things to actually understand it. And just for exploring the different styles, you can see a lot of variety within the society. Whereas if you looked at the architecture of the 18th century, you would mostly see neoclassical buildings, and while that is definitely representing what some of the intellectuals were thinking about, it only shows one part of the social opinion, whereas Victorian architecture, what definitely not probably does not represent every aspect of society, represents more opinions, and sometimes not only by intellectuals and the monarchy and whatever, but also of the people. So yeah, it is all inspiring, in my opinion. And while the style was not new, they did make some innovations such as steel structures, some cast iron structures, and they were exploring with new materials. Though most people forget about those, and they just label them as industry and do not consider it architecture. So I'll probably talk about that in a future video. But yeah, the Victorian era was really interesting in terms of architecture.